In the summer of 1871, when the air above London seemed permanently bruised with coal smoke, and the cobblestones slick with sewage from overcrowded streets, a building on the eastern edge of Whitechapel closed its gates for the last time. Briarwood Orphanage, a hulking structure of blackened brick and ivy-strangled windows that had housed nearly 200 children over 3 decades, though in its final days only 17 remained inside its walls, and by the turn of August those 17 were gone. Official records offer nothing beyond a single dismissive line in the Board of Charities ledger: institution shuttered, children transferred. Yet not a single trace of their existence emerges in parish documents, school admissions, or census rolls from that year onward, as though they had been excised not only from London, but from memory itself. What we possess instead are fragments, discovered piecemeal over the next century, a half-burned report retrieved from an incinerator in Stepney, unsigned and undated, warning of nightly disturbances of the children's dormitory, a clerk's memorandum scribbled in the margin of his accounts that reads simply, "They whisper about her in the rafters, and I no longer sleep," and most disturbing of all, a diary page that surfaced in 1894 when the house was briefly unboarded during an inspection, found wedged between the cracked floorboards of the West Wing chapel. That page, now brittle as autumn leaves, is attributed to a girl named Clara, aged 9, who writes in looping, uncertain hand, "The lady came again tonight. She leaned through the door without opening it, and her breath made the candle die. She stroked Mary's hair and left soot upon her pillow. She says she will carry us all above the roofs when the chimneys call her, and though I do not want to leave my bed, she says my bed will not keep me." At the bottom of the page, in smears of black that look less like ink than the rubbed remnants of charcoal, appears a circular mark with faint radiating lines, almost as though smoke itself had settled into the paper. When the page was first examined in 1903 by an archivist at the Guildhall Library, he noted in his private logbook, later suppressed by his superiors, that the stain seemed to shift when left under lamplight, as if its edges blurred and drifted, and that by morning ash had dusted the surface of his desk, though no fire had burned nearby. Even before the disappearance, Briarwood's reputation was dark. Neighbors claimed that the children sang late into the night, not with joy, but with a flat monotone, more like chanting than hymn, and sometimes their voices carried into the streets long past midnight, repeating the same refrain in words the listeners could not understand. Local constables assigned to the area resigned in rapid succession, writing no formal reports but leaving behind brief statements to colleagues. "It watches through the windows. The little ones are never alone. She is among them." One constable, identified only as Whitcomb, was said to have shot himself in his barracks after 3 nights stationed near the orphanage, leaving behind a single note that read, "17 will go together. Do not try to follow." The press of the time, scandal-hungry as ever, ignored the whispers, focusing instead on broader horrors: the cholera epidemic that cut swaths through the poor, the starvation in tenements, the rising tide of vagrancy. Yet in alleys near Briarwood, mothers warned their children never to walk past the gates after dusk, and rag pickers swore they saw shapes move behind the boarded windows, not shadows of children, but of something taller, stretched, its limbs too thin, its hair drifting like smoke even in still air. The first serious re-examination came in 1923, when municipal clerk Harold Fletcher was ordered to catalog abandoned properties. His notes, confiscated after his death, were later rediscovered in a locked drawer sold at auction in Shoreditch. In these pages, Fletcher describes entering the dust-choked chapel, where he found rows of small leather shoes neatly lined across the altar, their buckles corroded, yet untouched by vermin, as if preserved with unnatural care. Beside them, pinned to the wall with a rusted nail, was a daguerreotype photograph. 17 children standing stiffly in rows, each gazing directly at the lens. Their faces are blurred with age, yet every witness who has examined the plate insists on the same impossible detail, that the eyes are not blank, as expected of long-exposed daguerreotypes, but pits of absolute black, as if the chemical process recorded not light, but void. Fletcher notes the air grew heavy in his lungs, acrid like burned cloth, and that ash fell from the rafters, though no fire had touched the building in half a century. His last entry ends abruptly. "They are still here, waiting in their beds. I heard them counting, one by one, until the 17th name." The remainder of the page is smudged, smeared as though by damp fingers, or perhaps something less human pressing against the paper. Through the decades, Briarwood became a ruin, fenced off by the city, yet trespassers continued to slip inside. In 1956, a group of youths who broke in reported voices singing in the dark, describing it as a hymn slowed to the point of suffocation, and when they fled, one boy claimed he felt a hand grip his wrist, though no one stood beside him. Bruises in the shape of child-sized fingers remained for weeks. In the 1970s, urban explorers armed with tape recorders captured fragments of sound, laughter, too sharp and sudden, followed by a whisper overlapping itself in multiple tones, repeating the word home. One explorer described seeing children staring through the rotted floorboards, their pale faces lit by no natural light, and though his companions laughed it off, he never entered another ruin again. To this day, those who walk past the fenced lot swear the boards rattle without wind, that soot sometimes drifts outward into the street, and that if one pauses too long, a chorus of faint voices rises, humming in unison, always 17 strong. And so it is with this trail of ash and silence, these scraps of diaries, forbidden reports, and photographs that defy reason, that the story of the Ashen Orphanage begins, not as folklore nor as fiction, but as a scar burned into the city's forgotten ledger, a night in 1871, when 17 children vanished without a trace, leaving only soot, silence, and eyes that never ceased to watch. By the time Briarwood Orphanage reached its final years, the City of London was already a crucible of misery and smoke, where the poor suffocated in slums so crowded that entire families slept in shifts upon the same vermin-ridden straw mattress, and where children without parents, victims of cholera, typhus, gin-soaked fathers and mothers starved to bone, were gathered into institutions like Briarwood not out of charity but out of necessity, for the streets could not bear the weight of so many waifs without order.
The building itself stood on the margins of Whitechapel, its blackened bricks rising like a fortress against the soot-streaked sky, with high, iron-spiked gates meant as much to keep children in as to keep intruders out. Inside, the corridors smelled perpetually of boiled oats and coal tar, the floors scrubbed with carbolic soap until the wood warped, and the air filled with the constant coughs of consumptive throats. Daily life was a ritual of repetition. Children woke at the clang of a cracked handbell before dawn, filed into the dining hall for thin porridge, and recited scripture in whispers under the watch of the matrons, women whose faces seemed carved from the same stone as the orphanage walls, gaunt, unsmiling, their black dresses perpetually dusted with ash from the coal stoves. The younger children remembered them only as Sister Agnes or Sister Ruth, though none were true nuns, merely widows and spinsters of the parish pressed into service. Their discipline was swift and merciless. A wooden ruler across the knuckles for whispered laughter, a night locked in the unheated laundry for tears. And yet beneath their severity lurked something worse. Not compassion hidden under hardness, but a strange detachment, as if they too were children trapped in the house, going through motions dictated by someone unseen. Witness accounts collected decades later describe the matrons standing for long hours at the dormitory windows, staring not outward into the fog, but upward into the smokestacks across the river, their lips moving soundlessly. The orphans themselves lived in narrow beds aligned with military precision, each covered with gray woolen blankets thin as paper, stuffed with straw that grew damp and moldy in winter. By lamplight, they sewed garments for local factories, tiny hands stitching until fingers bled, while an overseer counted aloud the number of completed seams, his voice echoing down the hallway. Hunger was constant. Portions were so meager that older boys stole crusts from younger girls, and punishments for theft involved kneeling for hours upon dried peas until knees bruised purple. And yet within this rigid misery, strange details began to surface. Details recorded not in official reports, but in scattered journals, police notes, and whispered recollections. Children were said to wake with soot smudges upon their faces, despite no fire burning nearby. Laundry hung in the yard came in from the line streaked with black dust that fell only within the orphanage grounds. A neighbor who lived opposite the western wing later told investigators that he often saw pale faces pressed against the glass long after curfew, the outlines of children staring not into the street, but upward toward the drifting chimney smoke. Historical records of London at the time confirm that cholera outbreaks swept Whitechapel in 1870 and 1871, killing hundreds, yet not a single death certificate exists for any Briarwood child in those years, nor for the matrons. This absence troubled Harold Fletcher in his 1923 investigation, leading him to note that the children of Briarwood seemed to have slipped between the cracks of the parish registers, a phrase eerily echoed in a single surviving letter from a matron named Eliza Gray to her sister, found decades later in a trunk sold at auction. They are restless. They count when we do not. 17 voices in the night, and they do not sound like children anymore. I pray you, do not visit us. The air here is wrong. Eliza's name vanishes from records after this letter. No burial, no emigration, no further trace. To understand the background of Briarwood is also to understand the cruelty of its neighborhood. Whitechapel in the 1870s was a landscape of gin shops, slaughterhouses, and lodging houses so foul that reformers described the smell as a physical assault upon the lungs. The orphanage stood near the site of a disused tannery, its walls stained by years of animal fat and lye, and even in summer the ground oozed with black water. Rats nested in the drains, and it was said that the children played with them like pets, naming them, feeding them crumbs, only for the rats to vanish after nights when the lady was seen drifting the halls. It is from this background, so steeped in hunger, disease, and whispered superstition, that the legend of the Ashen Lady emerges, not as a simple ghost story, but as a presence so woven into the fabric of daily routine that it became impossible to tell where misery ended and haunting began. The children's days were filled with labor and silence, but their nights, according to surviving testimonies, were filled with whispers through the walls, shadows passing without footsteps, and lullabies sung in voices they did not recognize. And when 17 children disappeared in a single night, it was not from a life of joy torn short, but from a world already drowning in horror disguised as ordinary existence, a horror as real as soot upon the skin.
The first signs that something had begun to rot within Briarwood were subtle enough to escape the ledgers and official notices, yet persistent enough that they leaked into the private writings of those who lived and worked in its shadow, scraps that paint a picture more damning than any coroner's report. The earliest mention comes from a constable's notebook in late spring of 1871, in which he describes being summoned to the orphanage after complaints of disturbance, only to find no visible intruder, but every candle in the dormitory extinguished at once, leaving 17 children sitting upright in the dark as though awaiting a command. Their faces calm, their hands folded neatly in their laps, not one of them crying or frightened, though several later bore smudges of black ash upon their fingers and lips. The constable, unnerved, wrote only, "They look too still, not like sleeping children. They sit like mourners at their own graves." Soon after, animals in the vicinity began to perish inexplicably. A flock of pigeons discovered sprawled lifeless upon the cobblestones outside the gate, their feathers dusted with soot. A mongrel dog, belonging to the groundskeeper, found stiff in its kennel, its muzzle charred as though pressed to embers, though no fire had been lit nearby. The matrons explained these away with hollow voices, but neighbors whispered that the deaths coincided with nights when gray mist seeped from the orphanage's chimney, even though no coal had been delivered for weeks. Diaries of 2 surviving apprentices from a factory adjacent to Briarwood mention hearing children chanting after midnight, a sound not joyous, not hymn, but the flat murmur of a prayer repeated too long. And once, the apprentices claimed, they heard the word 17 whispered again and again, echoing through the alleys as if carried by smoke. The children themselves seemed to sense more than they spoke aloud. Clara's diary, already infamous for its description of the lady, also records strange behavior among her peers. Thomas does not play anymore. He only stares at the window, waiting. He says he sees her there, but when we look, it is only our faces. Mary laughs when no one speaks, and she will not sleep unless the fire is out, for she says the light hurts her. One night, Clara writes, she awoke to find every child in the dormitory sitting on the floorboards in a circle, their eyes closed, humming in unison, while Sister Agnes stood among them with her palms lifted toward the ceiling, ash streaked across her cheeks like war paint. Clara insists she herself was pulled into the circle by unseen hands, and when she closed her eyes, she smelled smoke, but not the acrid smoke of coal. Sweet, almost fragrant, like burning lavender, lulling her into calm. She ends the entry with the words, "We belong to her." The matrons say so. From this point forward, testimonies from outsiders grow darker. A chimney sweep who passed through the grounds recalled finding one of the boys crouched in the yard, carefully drawing circles in soot along the stones, muttering names under his breath. When the sweep asked what he was doing, the boy looked up with wide, empty eyes and replied, "Counting the ones she wants." He had traced exactly 17 rings upon the ground. There were disappearances, too, though they went unrecorded. A laundress employed by the orphanage vanished after claiming she heard a woman's voice singing from inside the walls, low and soothing, like a lullaby meant for infants. A volunteer teacher suddenly resigned after walking into the chapel and finding all the hymnals open to the same page, each one smeared with black fingerprints, though the children's hands were clean. In the weeks before August, the atmosphere within Briarwood grew so heavy that even passing policemen described it as difficult to breathe. The air cloyed with invisible dust, and several complained of black streaks on their uniforms that no washing removed. Still, there was never evidence strong enough to shutter the place. No mass grave, no bodies, only strange behaviors, odd deaths, and whispers of a lady who seemed to move through doors without opening them, leaving soot where she touched. And perhaps most chilling of all are the final testimonies of the children themselves, scraps of paper later found hidden in their bed frames. "She is almost ready. Do not cry, we are chosen. 17 together, 17 forever." Words written in childish scrawl, yet carrying a conviction beyond their years, as though they knew they were standing at the threshold of something vast and black, and instead of fear, they felt only the calm of surrender.
By mid-July of 1871, the disturbances within Briarwood had grown from eerie whispers into a pattern of tragedies too numerous to ignore, though the authorities continued to smother them beneath bureaucratic silence, insisting nothing was amiss, while neighbors muttered of smoke that wandered without fire and of voices that called from empty rooms. The first undeniable death was that of Sister Ruth, found at dawn slumped across the stone floor of the chapel, her face blackened as if pressed to a furnace door. Yet no fire had burned in the grate for weeks, and her body gave off no heat, only a fine dusting of gray ash that scattered like snow when touched. The coroner who examined her refused to sign the death certificate, writing in his private logbook, "Cause not natural, lungs hollow as if air consumed from within. The eyes, still open, contain soot." He resigned the following day, leaving the orphanage without official oversight. In the wake of her death, the children grew stranger still. They refused food, but showed no hunger. They scratched circles into their bed frames with fingernails until their fingers bled, and they were heard singing in languages unknown, words that twisted through the halls like draughts of smoke. Witnesses claimed that the youngest, a boy of 7, walked barefoot through hot coals spilled from the stove without a cry, his feet unburned, and when asked why, he whispered, "She carried me." The parish at last dispatched a visiting chaplain, Father Alistair Hume, to examine the situation, and his journals, later confiscated and hidden in diocesan vaults, remained the most chilling testimony of what unfolded. On his first night, he wrote, "The children do not blink. When I ask about prayer, they recite in unison words I do not recognize, yet their mouths move perfectly together. I am certain they are repeating after some unseen prompter. The matrons watch me with hollow eyes. They do not answer questions." On the second night, he described hearing a chorus of many voices emanating from the empty dormitory, though all 17 children were asleep in their beds, their mouths closed, their chests unmoving as though they no longer breathed. Most disturbing is his final entry, "I have seen her, the Ashen Lady. She stood at the end of the hall, her body shifting like smoke, her face indistinct, but her eyes black pits that swallowed the lamplight. The children rose from their beds to follow her, 17 in number. When I shouted, they turned to me, and I swear their mouths opened wide, and from within came not breath, but ash. I cannot remain another night."
His notes end there, with a smear of black across the page, as though the inkpot itself had been overturned, though later archivists insisted it was not ink, but something powdery, something that smelled of burned cloth. Father Hume never returned to his parish. Some say he fled overseas, others that he locked himself in a monastery and never spoke again, but his name vanishes from all records after that summer. Meanwhile, the tragedies around Briarwood spread outward. A constable assigned to watch the gates was discovered drowned in the Thames, his lungs packed with ash rather than water. A seamstress who delivered bolts of cloth for the children's labor collapsed in her shop, her final words a broken whisper of 17 eyes in the dark. By late July, neighbors refused to pass the orphanage at night, reporting that soot fell from the eaves though no chimney smoked, and that small hands rattled the fence as though begging release. A surviving letter from one such neighbor, addressed to a cousin in Kent, records, "I saw them, 17 children lined in the yard, standing too still, their faces tilted skyward as if waiting for a signal. When I blinked, they were gone, but footprints of ash remained. The parish attempted to transfer the children to another institution, yet each attempt failed. Carriages overturned, drivers fell ill, papers vanished. It was as though the orphanage itself refused to release them." The climax of the escalation came on the final week of July, when Sister Agnes, the last surviving matron, was found wandering Whitechapel barefoot in the rain, her dress in tatters, her eyes blind yet weeping black tears. To every passer-by she repeated the same phrase, 17 must go together, she will not take less. Within hours she collapsed and died, her body decomposing with unnatural speed until nothing remained but a heap of gray dust that the rain washed into the gutters. From that moment, Briarwood was abandoned by all authority. The gates rusted, the walls crumbled, and the children were left alone within, their existence marked only by whispers and the occasional glimpse of pale faces at the windows. It was into this escalating terror that the fateful night of August approached, the night that would erase them all, but not before leaving behind letters, diaries, and photographs that even now breathe ash when opened, proof that something ancient and merciless had claimed the orphanage and everyone who dwelt within.
The true revelation of Briarwood's damnation emerged not in the moment of horror itself, but decades later, when the building, half collapsed and cloaked in ivy, was slated for demolition in 1903. For beneath the rotting floorboards and behind walls sealed with rusted nails, workmen discovered a warren of hidden chambers that transformed rumor into dreadful certainty. In those airless rooms lay iron beds fitted with leather straps, ledgers filled with meticulous handwriting, and jars sealed with wax containing fragments of what appeared to be human lung tissue, blackened and brittle as cinders, each labeled with a child's name and age, 17 in all. Though no death records were ever filed, scholars who briefly examined the ledgers before they were confiscated by the ministry found references to a figure called Mater Cineris, the Mother of Ash, described not as a spirit, but as a medium of purification, summoned through a series of rites performed on orphans selected for their pliable souls and impressionable flesh, suggesting that the orphanage was less a refuge than an altar, its children not victims of chance but subjects of deliberate experiment. One particularly disturbing entry, written in Latin, translates, "The smoke is the spirit leaving. If harnessed, it may carry knowledge beyond death. 17 vessels required, none may be spared." The implication was unmistakable. The matrons and clergy had conspired in a ritual designed to create or sustain the Ashen Lady, binding her to the children and feeding her with their lives. Further evidence came from a locked trunk,
opened only once before vanishing into government archives, which contained daguerreotypes, grainy, ghostly images of the children lined in rows, their eyes glazed, their mouths slightly open as though caught mid-breath. Behind them loomed a shadowy figure, resembling a woman, blurred as if formed of smoke, visible despite the primitive lens. One photo bore a chilling note scrawled on its reverse, 17 in her care, they do not age. Alongside the photographs lay fragments of correspondence between the headmistress and an unnamed benefactor, possibly within the church hierarchy, speaking of progress and harvests of ash, with promises that Briarwood would yield the final key. When demolition workers uncovered a narrow staircase descending to a stone chamber beneath the orphanage, they found on its walls crude murals painted in soot, children kneeling before a towering woman whose body dissolved into clouds of gray, her outstretched hands releasing streams of smoke into their mouths. Most disturbing was a circle of 17 child-sized chairs, each containing nothing but piles of ash, perfectly shaped to the weight of a seated body. At this point, the narrative of the Ashen Orphanage ceased to be a ghost story and became something darker, an intersection of faith, science, and fanaticism where children had been reduced to conduits for forces beyond comprehension. The revelation shattered the fragile comfort of believing the children had merely vanished. They had been transformed, their lives consumed in a process both ritualistic and experimental. Eyewitness reports claimed that when the final chamber was breached, a cold wind erupted from within, carrying with it particles of gray dust that clung to the men's clothes and skin for weeks. One worker died days later from what doctors described as lungs filled with soot, though he had never set foot near a fire. His widow testified that his last words, whispered with bloody foam at his lips, were, 17, she calls again. Though the government attempted to suppress all findings, sealing documents and dispersing artifacts into private collections, fragments escaped into the hands of occult societies and private collectors. A priest in Paris claimed to own one of the jars, its contents slowly disintegrating into ash whenever exposed to moonlight. A collector in Berlin allegedly displayed one of the photographs, though those who viewed it swore the children's faces shifted position between visits. The greatest revelation, however, was not the artifacts themselves, but the understanding they carried. That the Ashen Lady was not an external haunting, but a construct of deliberate design, an entity birthed and nurtured through sacrifice, whose existence depended upon the destruction of innocent lives, and that those who created her intended not simply to appease, but to wield her. The orphanage was a crucible, its children fuel, its rituals the spark, and the silence surrounding it, maintained by church and state alike, was not ignorance, but complicity. Thus, the revelation drew its terrible conclusion. Briarwood had not been cursed by chance, it had been built as an offering. The Ashen Lady was no ghost to be banished, but a legacy to be continued. And every uncovered ledger, every ash-filled jar, every spectral photograph testified not only to what had been done, but to what still might be done. For the final notes within the headmistress's journal bore a promise written in a hand shaky yet triumphant. When the ash is scattered, it will find new vessels. 17 shall rise again. And with that, the secret of Briarwood was no longer a question of what had happened, but of what was yet to come.
The story of Briarwood Orphanage does not end with its demolition, nor with the scattering of ash across London's gutters. For the final and most chilling truth is that nothing born of ritual ever truly dies. And every attempt to bury the evidence only deepened the sense that the Ashen Lady's reach had grown far beyond the crumbling walls of her original sanctuary. After the demolition of 1903, newspapers briefly reported a string of unexplained deaths among the laborers who had participated, each man suffocating in his sleep as if smoke had filled his lungs. Yet no fire had touched their homes, and their corpses were found surrounded by a fine gray dust that police dismissed as chimney soot, though none of their houses contained working fireplaces. Families begged for inquiries, but the city declared the deaths unrelated accidents, quietly issuing stipends to widows as if to purchase silence. In 1911, a scholar from King's College, who had secretly retained fragments of the Briarwood ledgers, published a monograph on ritual sacrifice in European religious sects. Within weeks, he was found dead at his writing desk, his mouth filled with ash, his manuscript charred from the inside as though ignited by unseen fire. His surviving correspondence revealed that he believed the orphanage had only been one of several sites across Europe, each attempting to cultivate what he called an entity woven of breath and dust. If this was true, Briarwood was no isolated nightmare, but part of a network, and the 17 children were not victims chosen at random, but vessels crafted according to some arcane formula, replicated again and again across time. The most unsettling accounts, however, come from those who claim to have heard or seen the children long after the orphanage was razed. A retired constable in 1927 confessed on his deathbed that during night patrols in Whitechapel, he often glimpsed small figures moving in alleys, walking in perfect unison, their heads tilted skyward as though watching for someone unseen. When he approached, they dissolved into drifting cinders that clung to his coat until morning. In 1940, amid the Blitz, several fire wardens reported hearing children singing softly in the ruins of bombed houses, songs in languages unrecorded, always 17 voices together, echoing above the roar of flames. And as recently as the 1970s, a group of urban explorers who broke into the sealed underground vaults beneath the site claimed to have found a circle of child-sized chairs untouched by time, each coated in fresh ash, though the air was still, and among them a figure standing motionless, a woman formed of smoke, her face featureless, yet her eyes bottomless voids that forced them to flee without looking back. They never spoke publicly, but one of them, years later, scrolled on a wall in a psychiatric ward, "She waits for 17. She always waits." The greatest terror is that the documents themselves seem alive, as though contaminated by the very presence they describe. Historians who attempt to handle the original ledgers often report coughing fits, phantom smells of burning cloth, or the sensation of dust in their throats. One archivist swore that when she turned a brittle page, soot spilled onto her hands in such quantity she thought the book itself was disintegrating, yet the paper remained intact. More than one collector has died under mysterious circumstances, their homes found choked with ash, though no source of fire was present. The church, when pressed, denies all involvement, insisting Briarwood was simply a poorly funded orphanage lost to neglect. But files periodically surface hinting at continued research into Mater Cineris, always in the same cramped handwriting, always ending with the promise, 17 will rise again. Whether these files are clever forgeries or something more sinister remains unknown, but their recurrence across decades suggests that someone or something ensures the story never dies. And here is where the trail bleeds into the present.
Within London's own city archives, locked away from public view, exists a sealed folder labeled Briarwood 2009, containing reports from social workers investigating a foster home in Hackney where 17 children inexplicably vanished one night, leaving only fine gray dust across their beds. The folder was marked classified, ongoing, and withdrawn from circulation, yet copies of the first page leaked, confirming the number 17, confirming the ash, confirming the cycle has not ended. If so, then the Ashen Lady has never left, her hunger never sated, her ritual never broken. She waits not in ruins or in forgotten legends, but in the cracks of our modern cities, in every empty house that groans in the wind, in every breath that tastes faintly of smoke. And the most dreadful thought is the simplest, that somewhere, at this very moment, a child stands at a window, staring upward with unblinking eyes, waiting to be counted among the 17. For if the Ashen Lady is truly born of sacrifice, then each generation provides her fuel anew, and silence is her greatest accomplice. The tale of Briarwood Orphanage is not a closed chapter, but a living curse. And as long as ash clings to the breath of the living, the Ashen Lady walks unseen, gathering her children one by one, until the circle is complete and 17 voices sing once more in the darkness.